We're here live for this week's episode of Talk.Energy Insights. It's been a couple weeks, Hike. We had taken a little bit of a hiatus here, but lots happened. Lots happened in those 2 weeks. Today is March 3rd, 2022. And why don't you fill everybody in on what else has been going on as of
so we're essentially living in history. So we've come out of a global pandemic, and now we've got Russia invading Ukraine, and that's long dated. There's short-term, medium-term, and long-term implications that seem like they're going to happen. And now, we've got oil markets and massive backwardation, which essentially is telling the world pull everything you can out of storage to try to, feed the demand as Russian barrels are at risk. You've got an acceleration of an Iranian nuclear deal on the tape as well. So those barrels coming back, and the reality is we're trying to get to price points where I think demand gets destroyed, because it isn't necessarily a supply question. And a backwardated curve, a lot of people are like, man, oil's high in the front. What that's saying is, really, I've always said this, the world's saying pull oil out today and we'll worry about the future in the future. And the reality is you think about where Europe is and then where the world is, you now have a big geopolitical premium put into the oil markets, but, medium term, going into each winter, I think there's going to be a big call on, restocking every coal stack in Germany, restocking gas storage facilities. I think hydroelectric dams are going to be filled to the brim. And I think oil inventories have to get refilled globally as well. And you look at Cushing at really low levels, essentially almost at operating minimums. It's a situation that is saying that the curve needs to move from backwardation to contango to incentivize storage again. And that just is this roll up. The next 6 months, I think we're above $100 now. And I think we're just going to keep seeing this roll up of price to start trying to encourage, some degree of storage going into the next winter. But it is a dramatic time of in the energy markets and really in the world. Like it's really telling. I'm no expert on Russian politics. I don't think anybody is. If you're not in Putin's head, you don't know what's going to happen. But my heart goes out to the amount of suffering that people are going through, on the other side of the world, and I know yours does as well. It's just heartbreaking to watch and see. 1 million people are leaving Ukraine, carrying in their wheeled suitcases behind them. And you can just put yourself in that position. It's a tragedy. So
it is a tragedy, and I think we should probably let's talk about the war first. And there's tons to talk about in energy. It's a mess, to be honest. The energy stuff is a mess, and it's not been something that has happened. It's happened quickly, but it's also been kind of simmering behind the scenes. And it's a lot of the themes that I've talked about on the podcast. You and I have talked about some of them as well. Just this kind of hopeful or wishful thinking around energy policy that we can. Energy is sovereignty at the end of the day. And I'm not saying this war is over energy, but it's playing a major factor in it. And before we get on all the energy stuff, just the war in Ukraine is just terribly tragic. I was watching it on the news the other day at lunch. I've got a TV in my office. I don't turn it on much, but I'll sometimes eat lunch in there and just, throw on the news. I hardly even watch mainstream news, but there was just people talking. One of the Ukrainian government officials that's in Kharkiv, or however you say it, their second largest city, and it was a woman, and she was talking, and I just felt sick to my stomach listening to everything that was going on. And it's a humanitarian disaster. What Putin's doing. I'm just going to condemn it. I don't know the answer. I think what we're doing in terms of, when I by the answer, I mean the West is response. And I think that this, what we're doing with the sanctions, it's clearly hurting Russia. It's also hurting a lot of people that are fairly innocent in terms of the citizens. What are they, what can they really do? They're not even allowed to have free speech or protest over there. So we are hurting a lot of innocents through the sanctions, but it's, an effective way to punish Russia. We're doing a lot of things outside of Russia, some of which I agree with. Some of them are a little troubling, to be honest. The targeting of Russian businesses and products and people around the world, not a great feeling, to be honest. Anything kind of based on someone's race or nationality and calling them out. I mean, it's not like these people that are Russian businesses that sell Russian products or do these Russian things. It's not, it's not that they're the ones attacking in Ukraine. It is their country. So I don't know the answer. It's just there really are no good answers in war. And in Europe, it's just you've got a long, violent history in these countries. And I'm a big history nerd, and I've even been reading a book just recently on the medieval times. And even Ukraine is just, I tweeted the other day, they were attacked by the Mongols. They've been attacked. There's so many times in history that these cities have been under siege or been attacked. And we've just been through a really long and very fortunate period of peace, and now we're not. And it's hard to watch, and I don't know what's going to happen, but I hope that it can get resolved.
Yeah, it just seems like, if you think through like Sun Tzu's comment of always leave your enemy a golden bridge of retreat, like there's not an off ramp. That's the thing that is the strangest thing of like, where do you de-escalate? And then the final thing, medium term, you can go back through, like, we still have sanctions on Cuba. We have back to the 1960s. There's sanctions on Iran back to the late 70s. Like the people that think that sanctions on Russia, as long as Putin's in control, they're just going to last. And so like it isn't a short-term situation, given kind of how both governments and then there's self-sanctioning of companies and traders, just worrying, and the ability to transact has gotten harder. So it's this duration, I think, is the thing that makes me think we're headed towards a global recession. Like and that's where it gets to like price escalation, and you start thinking about stagflation, which I've talked to a lot of investors over this week. Like no one has actually invested through stagflation, which would be the 70s. And so essentially right now, if you think back, so we've gone through the worst global pandemic since 1918. We're essentially, for the first time in a military conflict where nuclear options are a possibility since the Cuban Missile Crisis, we have the stagflation worries of the 1970s, and we're essentially all not aware or equipped with what exactly will happen and how things happen.
And we have got a record, just ridiculous amount of debt that we didn't have in the 1970s, and the tools to combat stagflation, there's not much in the tool belt right now. We basically need to tighten. The Fed is in just denial. I mean, Powell came out and said it's nothing that they're doing is causing the inflation. He's blaming it on fiscal policy, supply chain constraints, et cetera. Anything else, energy, whatever. But I think this week he had a comment saying this isn't the Fed's policy driving this, and it's like clearly. It is. It's driving it in a lot of ways, primarily the lack of ability for anyone to get any yield on assets unless taking on risk, which has been this way for decades now. And so you've got a tremendous amount of risk, a tremendous amount of debt, and it's just a very odd and eerie time.
Yeah, I think that the energy markets, and we've talked about crises, like it takes some snap event to let everybody realize. And the reality is the energy markets have effectively been extremely volatile, and candidly, hydrocarbons have been not reliable and super expensive. Like you think about the Texas freeze we had a year ago to European price spikes, like the fragility of the entire system, regardless of what your bent is on renewables or hydrocarbons. There's just this extreme underinvestment that I think in infrastructure and in energy and in the fossil side particularly, that is just coming to roost. Like gravity is gravity in OPEC plus, and the under delivery of volumes. I mean, it's just the underinvestment is now flowing through, and I don't think there's a necessary response until we get to the point of really offsetting demand, which is super hard on the economy. So yeah, and then really what's telling to me is if you look at what's happened on price, the energy stocks essentially are some of these companies are going through extreme self-help. So the 2019, 2020, 2021 years for North American companies were tightening the belt, redefining operations, and getting way more efficient. And now you've got an efficient industry that's getting this groundswell of higher commodity prices. And they're essentially, when you said you can't get yield anywhere, my my brain turns to a bunch of upstream E&P companies where there's a whole lot of yield, and they're trying to get that cash back to shareholders. And so you're going to see, share buybacks, you're going to see dividends, variable dividends, special dividends, and double-digit returns to shareholders this year. And what that also does is it keeps the macro in check. And we just came out of year-end reporting and kind of guidance for 2022. And the reality is the North America is not going to overwhelm on supply. And if anything, the services industry is super tight. Everything from 4.5 to 5 to 5.5 inch steel to services. Had one company talk about out of the rig they just picked up, 60% of the people have less than 60 days of experience. Like that just is you got to go slow in that situation. You have to slow down to respect safety. Like safety is the first step. I mean, people shouldn't get hurt when they go to work, and that's just going to slow things down, and that'll degrade some of the efficiency. And so I look at this setup of massive outperformance for energy should be coming for investors, and I think that I'm trying to think through why I shouldn't be bullish. And so you think about when you're bullish stocks. I'm going to talk a little bit of details of like the broad market. You want companies that have like an improving chart. So 50-day moving averages are going in the right direction, so they're not trading below that. You then start thinking about where do they have free cash flow, where do they have yield, and where exactly are their estimates getting better. And what the reality is every day the commodity ticks a little higher and the backwardation flows through into contango. 2023 is going to get better, and upward revisions to estimates is something that people will be looking for, and energy is one of the few places that I think you're going to find it. High volatility, but good performance is what we're thinking about. So
yeah, it seems so. I mean, there's just not a lot, in my opinion, in the near term at least, that can dampen. Certainly, I just feel like oil is just, for all the reasons you mentioned, I'm not going to articulate it as well as you did earlier in the conversation, but oil just seems very bullish. Nat gas is, we'll see. It's a weird market in the U.S. We're very fortunate we have it. Think about, in the world right now from a national security standpoint, what we're doing, just in the U.S. We're very fortunate in that the innovation and the technology here that we've been able to unlock these resources. It gets back to free markets and capitalism. We've been able to have personal property rights for minerals, which have basically rolled through to innovation and now to abundant supply. The rest of the world doesn't have that, and we're reaping the benefits of that. And so it's extremely fortunate. And we're seeing in Europe the national security implications of not having, a healthy energy industry, from shutting down baseload nuclear plants like in Germany, and the things that the reliance on countries like Russia. We brush that stuff off all the time, right? And I've said this a bunch, and I never want to come off conspiratorial. I always want to come off analytical. But, reliance on China for a lot of our stuff, it's already bad enough. Do we want to push energy? Do we want to push our energy over to the Middle East? I think like Pelosi came out today and said, we will not drill here. She doesn't want any drilling on public lands. And she's California, right? They're getting their energy from countries that a lot of times aren't our friends. So it just seems like there's still some people that are tone deaf, but we're very, very fortunate that we have capitalism and free markets in the U.S. because it's been a big savior. I mean, nat gas. I'm not going to continue to belabor this point, but I'm kind of doing a victory lap here. It's like I've been talking about this for a while.
Well, the near term and the reality is European policies are going to have to change, and so right. Germany baseload, they're going to burn more coal, right. And they're some of that's going to become wood pellets, and I think that they're going to be able to do some lower carbon sourcing, but they wanted to phase out coal by 2030, and they're not going to be able to. It's just the reality. I think you'll get an increase in carbon capture through Europe. I think you'll see an increase in LNG import facilities to get off Russian hydrocarbons. I think there's, you think about France, they got 50-year-old nukes that they're going to have to retrofit and refurbish. I think the Dutch, do they start considering opening up some of the gas fields in the North Sea? Some of that's earthquake driven, so they wouldn't be able to, but like hard choices of policy feel like they're going to have to be made in the medium term, because I don't think Russia just immediately flows back into normality, as long as Putin's in control. And that's the thing that is really the biggest shift. Like I think it's a medium term and then long term dirtying. And then I think hard policy changes need to come in where there are options to discourage demand at some point, and pay people to consume less. And those types of things are not like it's odd. Our policy is to have the cheapest gasoline we possibly can, but also then hate fossil fuels. It's like that isn't the right way to think about it. Dan Pickering and I've talked about this a lot, and like you drive to a poor neighborhood, and I went to a Chevron, and 3 of the 8 pumps, people had round numbers: $4, $10, and $20. And the reason they have that is that's the amount of money they had in their pockets to fill up with gasoline. Mm-hmm. And like that is, a lot of people that I think we associate with haven't been in a position where they've run out of gas because they didn't have enough cash. I've said this before. I've been there. And like whenever you start seeing round numbers at gasoline pumps, like that's an indication of things that people are having to make the hard decision and tighten their belts. And that's happening, and it's happening right now. Yeah. And that's in Houston, where it's $3.35 was the cheapest gas. Like imagine San Francisco, where gas is averaged above $5 right now. Right. I guarantee there's a bunch of round numbers being printed all around the city, right. As opposed to filling up completely. And that's the thing that I think slows economies down. Like that's the hard stuff that I think is coming, unfortunately.
Yeah, I filled up I got an F-150 EcoBoost, and it was like $92 today to fill it up, and wow. That's close to double what it's been. I mean, it's effectively, I've filled it up in the 40s easily, just not that long. I mean, during COVID, it was like high 30s, I think.
Yeah, what did it for that? I'm curious. Your F-150, what was the price tag when you bought it? I'm gonna go into a review.
Yeah, it was about I think the MSRP was close to like high 50s. And here's the crazy thing is that it's hilarious. So it's not the very, very top trim, mm-hmm. but it's pretty good trim. And when I got it 1 year used. It had 3,000 miles on it, and it was the loaner, and it was a dealership loaner. Yeah. And they knocked $16,000 off or $15,000 or $16,000 off the MSRP. So it was like in the mid to low 40s. And I thought that was ridiculous. I was like, this is like a super expensive car. Yeah. And I felt guilty buying it. And now to get that same truck, it's ridiculous.
What is it, 60 something now?
Oh, easily. I mean, the used ones are like that. Yeah. The new ones, the MSRP, I think, is up to close to 70. It's like high 60s now. It's over 10 grand above where it was.
Yep. So I a year ago, a little over that, put a Rivian on order, and Rivian's an electric vehicle truck, like super cool, like has the frunk and like it's all sorts of storage space, 400-mile range, and it was an $80,000 vehicle. And when you mentioned $16,000 knocked off, well, they just rolled $16,750 more onto my price. Wow. Because of supply chain. Rapidly, they came out and realized they're going through a PR disaster, and so they locked us back in at the $80,000 level. But I remember thinking $80,000 for a truck. I had an F-250 diesel, and I think it was around like in the 50s whenever I bought it. And I was like, 80 is a lot. And I just kind of wanted to live the experience of going to see, going from prototype to production personally, and like how they interacted with customers, like where the path was, like how are they doing things. But it was shocking to get almost $100,000 truck. And, we pulled, the Pep Insights team, Kevin Pollard pulled it, and I tweeted it. Like I think the average income in the US is like in the 60,000. So they're building a truck that's 143% of the average income of an American. And like, that isn't going to encourage electric vehicles. Like it's a toy for rich dudes, or girls. And, but like the reality is like that shocking $16,000 bump, is kind of an indication of where supply chains have tightened and like where prices can go. And it definitely is a little disheartening around, the adoption rate and where things actually will end up. But I just thought it was an interesting observation over the last 3 days of living the opening of emails from Rivian, and the heartfelt feeling of like, that can't be right.
Yeah.
But it totally was.
Well, I don't want to, I'm not trying to dunk on EVs right now. I've been skeptical for this is one reason too. And my reasoning has been that this is like, it's like with, I'll equate it to like Aubrey and Nat Gas at Chesapeake, because this is something I can relate to. And he had these predictions that were fantastical, and a lot of them were true. It was like he could produce all this gas. The part that wasn't true was the price of gas when you produced a bunch of it, right?
Yeah.
So now do the inverse of that. You have all these predictions of a bunch of car manufacturers now wanting to rush to EV, and what is it, like 10 of the, like all the top 10 ones say they're going to quit producing ICE vehicles in the next like 10 to 15 years, yet they show prices just going down. Like Aubrey was like, showed prices of nat gas staying high while he like cranked out all this new gas, and shale revolutionized the world. And it's like, this is counterintuitive. If everybody's rushing to these EVs to produce them, and the supply chains in the short and medium term just can't keep up, you would think the prices would go up. That with the backdrop of fiscal tightening, or excuse me, monetary tightening with interest rates, et cetera. Interest rates even go up a couple points. Now you're paying 6-7% on a car loan of a car that's costing 60 to 100,000 for an EV. It just gets very difficult to see who's buying these. And then you start to think about like government subsidizing them, and it's like, yeah, are you really going to subsidize $100,000 car for someone? That's not like the everyday man buying that. It's somebody who's wealthy enough to buy it.
I know we've talked about the electric compressor company that you guys looked at that would have replaced, effectively emissions that would dwarf Tesla's 2.4 million cars in a couple of years. And I think the equivalent price of EVs from a carbon offset is somewhere between $400 and $600 a ton, depending upon how you do the math of what is an ICE vehicle going to be emitting, like where are things going, like what are you really offsetting. But like there are better paths to solve the climate problem than EVs. And really, I'm an advocate. I think that they're fun to drive, and they're probably more reliable. And as you get autonomous, that's the next level of software where your car goes out and makes money for you in the future. But it's not everybody. And so that's the thing that I find so troubling. Both on both sides of the spectrum. The climate deniers would say that there's no reason to do that. Well, I mean, selling 8% of the vehicles that are EVs now, that's a positive for people are enjoying driving them.
You don't have to be a climate. You have to be a climate denier to not think EVs are a good idea. By the way, you can be someone who just don't think EVs are a good idea.
But they're fun to drive. Have you ever been in one? I mean, have you driven?
I have. One? I've not driven one actually. I have been in one, and they are cool. They look slick, and they're
no, like hitting the accelerator is a kick. I mean, I've driven fast cars. They're fast cars, and like they're not expensive fast cars. And so like the reality of the experience is fun. Now the question is it incrementally that much more fun? And that's where I keep coming to is like, you don't have to get 100% of vehicles sold, but everyone that's sold is like someone's enjoying it for some reason. And that's the way I think about like, and it really seems like hybrids are the most logical thing, where you have a gasoline backup for recharging, and that extends things, and they're super cheap, and you get a $20,000 vehicle in India and China. And that's where, the demand actually comes from. At some point, you ought to get rid of the subsidies. Like we should get rid of intangible drilling credits as well. Like the reality of the upstream space right now is, they're going to become massive cash taxpayers. And I hope that companies like start saying, look at how much money I just paid to the federal government because of what I'm making. Because otherwise you're going to hear stupid stuff like windfall profit taxes come in. And the reality is like their cash flows are high enough that they aren't spending enough capital to offset that, and they're becoming full cash taxpayers. And like own it, like make it a good thing. And that from a policy standpoint, at some point we don't need those subsidies for the energy space, and you don't need the subsidies for EVs as well. So I think that those things It's like, what are you trying to
Just get rid
incentivize?
of all subsidies. I'm not a fan of central planners. If you haven't figured that out yet, they
I
just
have to,
they
I have to
mess
give,
they mess things up. I mean, the free market actually it works. Surprisingly, gets back to a lot of the different themes of why it's just like it's the proof's in the pudding. I mean, we can see that these things work, and central planners, although they have good intentions, they're typically on a 4-year election cycle or whatever their cycle may be, and that drives weird decisions. And they're not experts in these things, right? And they get money from lobbyists, so there's a lot of problems with central planning. But we're not going to solve that here. But I think that, like, back to the energy side of it, with where this goes with the energy transition, let's kind of pivot. We've talked about EVs. We can talk more about these general themes, which have been just kind of tailwind, top down, a lot of investor interest, a bunch of capital flooding into the space, a lot of tailwinds, but now maybe some headwinds from the supply chain, the inflation, the energy security things. I mean, we're starting to see some cracks in the armor around the thesis for this stuff, right? And the report cards are coming in, and we've talked about this before. Some point you got to have midterms, and then you got to have finals, and then the next semester starts, and you get a report card, and you see you got a C last semester, and you're not doing great on your homework this semester. And so some point I mean, I think there is going to be innovation, and it's happening. And you're still hearing about people that are getting, I'm hearing anecdotally about jobs people are getting in the energy transition. I'm seeing it happening. I'm seeing CFOs of an oil and gas company that are now CFOs of a solar company or a carbon capture company. And so we're seeing that people are talented, smart people, and capital flows are still happening, but we got to be realistic. There seems to be some headwinds now, a little bit, at least more than there were
well,
the last 2 years.
and the reality is long-term interest rates go up, and effectively when you have zero cost of capital, you have an infinite price potential in what people would pay for those projects. And so
Right.
since they're all such long-term, you essentially, as interest rates increase, that long-term value degrades, and then you run into real numbers. It's a market that has turned from really stories to hard numbers, and that I think is the thing that is shifting in the energy transition side as we think about what we cover. Estimates are going the wrong direction, and prices are going up, not down. Supply chain is flowing through to just about every company
Right.
that has reported, and they're all down a lot because of that. And I think that the reality of the numbers is what I think is happening on the energy transition,
Right.
or climate tech, or whatever you want to call it.
Right.
But what's going to get interesting is we're getting to a point where Tesla gets down into the 300s, which would be blasphemy for some people that are probably listening to this. You're going to get to valuations that are actually pretty compelling. And that's what's interesting. We're seeing a big enough correction. Yeah. And that's what happens. Every cycle has an overreaction to the other side in and around commodities. And I still remember, I tell this story a lot. We were picking up solar companies in 2019, 2020, and we're an energy shop, and they didn't want us to cover them. And I was like, you make the most commodity of commodities called an electron. Differentiate what you make at the end of the day. It's impossible. And they hated me for it. But it's the truth. You may have a little technology around inverters, but at the end of the day, the product is an electron, and that's, you got to be lowest cost of supply. And candidly, they are actually lowest cost of supply in a lot of part of the world.
Right.
It's just you don't have reliability of supply 24 hours a day.
There's a really interesting comment today, or maybe it was on Twitter today. I think it was Energy Cynic posted something, and then I can't remember who said this, but they were we're talking about the energy industry, or the oil and gas industry, as a percentage of the S&P, and we've talked about it, and you've talked about this a bunch. And the thought was that it needs to grow dramatically to get back to where it was. And someone made the comment, they're like, no. These other ones that have
the rest of the market will shrink.
Right? So it was basically no, actually, it's going to grow, but it's going to be all this other stuff that got overinflated is going to shrink, which will then cause the percentage to rise. And I commented this because I agree with that. But what I will say, and this is where you see some what I would call overconfidence in the bulls, the energy bulls or the oil and gas bulls, is that they're like calling like the death of tech. And I'm like, no, no, no. You don't short tech long term. Long term, tech is going to continue to dominate. I mean, it's just a fact. We're not getting less technologically advanced. We're not getting less plugged into the internet, and we're not getting less digital. It's just not happening. So short term, medium term, interest rates, whatever you want to say, I agree with all that stuff. I would not want to be, I mean, the NASDAQ's getting crushed. Bitcoin's killing the NASDAQ, by the way. But I would not want to be, look, in the short term, I think there's some serious concerns because of the past of all this easy money. And that's kind of the next topic. I would love to talk about some money stuff here in a minute. But long term, you can't short tech. I mean, at some point, tech is continuing to accelerate, but certainly right now.
And it's an enabler. Like, it's deflationary and an enabler. And what's cool about the energy transition and climate is it's the convergence of massive capital projects that also have innovators coming in. And so like that I think is what's going to be fun over the next 10 years is watching projects move forward, and like real step changes in how you have the integration of, natural gas fields that have, some degree of solar overlaid on top of them and carbon capture. And so like you effectively get, blue natural gas or blue gasoline. And like the reality of like the goal is to, have efficient, low emissions, because it's just better for health. Like you don't even have to get into what's happening with climate. Like the best things that Congress did were in 1970 and 1990 around the Clean Air Act, but everything else they've done isn't very good, and hasn't really impacted the environment. So yeah, I think there's a whole lot of trying to make people healthier that could come through this enabling of cleaner hydrocarbon production. And I think that's happening for management teams. Like it's pretty freaking cool to talk to management teams, and they talk about that their emissions targets would go the wrong direction if they accelerated activity, and then they'd be paid less, because every management team wants to hit the 200% goal on their long-term incentive plan. And so like if I accelerate drilling, I'm going to have to flare more because I don't have my midstream solution in place. If I flare more, I make less money. And it's like $500,000, $1 million of potential comp for like senior management. And that's real money. And so like what's interesting is you're actually seeing a real behavior shift in the oil and gas space that is like healthy and actually leading to the behaviors that investors want, and people aren't paying attention to it. And it's all in the long-term incentive plans. Like LTIPs are going the right way with proxies this season, and something that I think is pretty cool. So,
well, wealth is health. I mean, in terms of the wealthier a country is, the healthier it is. We've seen that, and also wealth is cleanliness. And we've talked about this. It's like when you industrialize, yes, you're going to go through some period of time where you are a little dirtier, right? But look around. I mean, it's not that dirty in the U.S. We're very wealthy. They're the wealthiest country. And by dirty, I just mean like smog and just overall trash and pollution and everything else. I'm not talking really atmosphere. I'm talking earth, water, and air, which are the three of the four pillars of the environment. And then you got atmosphere, which is pretty nebulous in terms of the impacts. We know some of what it's doing. There's a lot of question marks also in terms of the long term. But in terms of just like the environment, our local environment, as you get a wealthier country, it's easier to focus on these things at the top of Maslow's pyramid. You can think about, hey, you know what? We should get better at recycling. We should get better at whatever the initiative is to make things cleaner, and then we do it. And so, I think that like this all kind of goes hand in hand. And at some level, in the energy industry, we're making some good strides in terms of the capital discipline and some of these things. But I don't know. It's a weird time. It feels weird to me that they're doing this. I guess it just gets back to incentives though, right? It's like,
no, like we talked about Oklahoma, like you guys are blessed with ample natural gas infrastructure, ample wind, and like you have this opportunity in the government where you don't have a huge not in my backyard problem. Like, and then you overlay, I thought your PRTI, it was like Party is their name? Like, do they actually talk about Wasn't that the?
I think it's just PRTI. Maybe they call them
No, but
Party. I've always heard
I mean,
it PRTI.
no, I know. I mean, whenever I was like, man, that's a party company, and they
Yeah,
just
yeah.
burn, they break down tires, and then Bitcoin mine with it. I thought it was a phenomenal story.
And they sell
and enjoyed it.
steel and
Yeah.
hydrocarbons. The cool thing about PRTI that I really like, there's a lot of things I like, and I hope that they have success. I know I think they're trying to raise capital. I got to interview Jason
okay.
Williams at this mining conference, and he's a big personality. I don't know if you follow him, the Parabolic guy on Twitter, but got to interview him, and then the CEO of Stronghold Resources. But they are solving a problem of recycling, and I haven't made this tweet yet. I'm going to make it at some point, but I'm like, we basically, we can't even recycle. There's 315 million tires a year that we just don't even recycle. We just throw them in landfills or burn them or grind them up. But we're going to recycle all these EV batteries, though, right, Hike? Like, we're just going to magically solve that, even though we don't have this tech for that. I want to like make a tweet about that, like a hot take. I'll release it here. But point is that they're looking at like a problem that's a big problem that also, cars will have if we switch to EVs, and they're trying to figure out a way to solve it with the free market solution. There's no government subsidies in what they're doing, at least yet, and I really think it's a cool story.
Mm-hmm. No, I thought it was interesting. Like the devulcanization of a tire is a complicated chemical process that requires a lot of energy input. So the fact that they're getting net positive energy out of that, I'm curious as far as how that actually flows and works.
Yeah, they're trying to raise. I think they're trying to raise capital for it. So hey, pivoting to let's talk about the money for a little bit. There's a lot of like all these sanctions with Russia. They've yet to really commit to sanction the energy, which I think is just like, it's not a good look, to be honest. I think it's politically driven. It's also economic, and there are some real concerns around safety in Europe. I mean, they put themselves in a position where it's not good in the winter for them to not be able to get Russian gas. I mean, there's real human lives, and you've talked about this before, that could be at risk if they can't, heat homes and do these things, which that's sad. But beyond that, I think a lot of it's politically motivated, like the U.S. I mean, it's not like we get that much oil from Russia. And so that's it's disheartening.
I think someone said it's like a couple 100,000 barrels a day is what Michael Cusimano said at one point on one of our calls. So it's not much oil. I know gas and LNG into the Northeast, there's definitely some overlay and linkages there, which is just a crazy thing of, what vessels are Jones Act or not. Like the fact that we can't flow
right,
an LNG tanker from the Gulf Coast directly because it's not Jones Act into Boston Harbor. Sometimes just we could just get rid of the Jones Act. Like crazy. It's crazy. And my New Orleans friends who run barges and boats would probably, whenever I show back there in late March, they're not going to be happy about it. But it should just go away. But the reality is, it's like. The policy decisions, and it's just, I think there is, what you said early is whenever I listen to politicians about talking about things that I know a lot about, they very rarely know a lot. And so whenever you're trying to react with sanctions, I got to think that there are people that are making decisions that don't know enough about the decisions. And so they shy away from the hardest decisions. And like the hardest decisions, like I've heard some really interesting think tank pieces around what if the European governments just paid people not to consume? Like you legitimately said, hey, you shut down, amount of gas consumption from Russia. We'll pay you to find some other way to run your business. There's like true, like incentivizing less demand. But those policies won't ever happen. Like they want to incentivize lower price. And like that's why you don't sanction, because you want to keep prices low, because the best way to get elected again is to not have utility bills go up a lot.
Right.
Someone asked a question, I think it was maybe Brian Sullivan from CNBC, had a tweet poll or like a question out for all the Northeasterners of like how much of your utility bills gone up this winter.
That. Yeah, I retweeted that.
I was like, that's a good question. Like that's the type of thing that's like real news and like really impacted. And,
tag your congressman and put your tag your congressman, put your increase.
Yeah, because it's real.
It is real. No, and I mean, like, it gets back to the not just so the energy,
money.
Go ahead.
Yeah,
the money thing. It gets back to this whole idea around. I mean, there's a lot of things. The sanctions you could talk about, and it's not all energy, but it affects it. I mean, like even like the airline stuff is really interesting. I read some incredibly thought provoking pieces around what that could mean for Russian people, and not just for Russians, but for the world. This idea that we can't have any flights in or out of Russia, or that they can't go in any of these
Yeah.
airspaces. And then there's also the SWIFT system and the money, and then this whole thing around their central bank and just basically shutting them off. And then it becomes like, what's the depth? Like Wall Street Journal had a piece on like what is money, and this is like hitting home because I've been thinking about this, and I've been thinking about it since I took and I failed the CFA. Got to level 2. I think I've said that before. So read all the books twice for level 2. I did not pass it. It was a really hard test, but but one thing that really stuck out to me when I did that was my mind was like broken when I tried to do all the currency stuff, because I just had this weird eerie feeling that like none of this is real. It's just all like there's no value. It's just a value in relation to other things. And I hadn't really thought about it. And then recently with Bitcoin, all this other stuff, I've really started to think about what is money. And it is one of the trippier things to think about in just terms of what all the ramifications are of it. It's like no one has really game theoried it out. Maybe the Bitcoiners have, I don't know. But a lot of people haven't really game theoried it out. And then you think about being able to shut off like a central bank's ability to access or transfer or use their reserves. It just starts to get very what are these reserves? It's fiat. Most of it's fiat. There's like a single digit percentage that's gold. You've got some of their I don't know. It's really weird when you start to think about fiat reserves for a central bank, and then their inability to transfer those. Then it's like, what are they really worth? And then that gets really scary because Russia's a meaningful piece of the world economy. It's a deep rabbit hole to start
No,
thinking
there's an
about all
interesting
this stuff.
question, and I was actually watching some of the Jerome Powell testimony, and a few things that were taken a little out of context. And like, would the U.S. dollar always be the singular reserve currency? And he's like, no, there could be another reserve currency. It wasn't. He was not saying that happens at all in the near term, or happens easily. But I think it's a reasoned, kind of the economist statement of, yeah, in one hand, this could happen, and on the other hand, that
Right.
could happen kind of statement. But it is kind of where the world could go. And then really what is the reason that the dollar is so dominant, other than, most commodities are traded in and around it. And like, it's like, it is backed by our massive economy.
Right.
But it is an interesting question of, I think it was the Bitcoin standard is what I remember reading. Was it 2020 whenever I started getting into crypto, and it goes through the definition of money, and like the hard money, soft money question is not something we need to dig into here, but like it is actually something that people ought to spend a little time thinking about of, what makes something durable and fungible, and a store of value, and a currency of transfer of value. And the soft monies of the world, I'd say there's a softening happening.
Yeah.
I don't think everybody thinks a lot about. And you've said it, like the amount of inflation that's happened in the last, like it is extremely meaningful, as far as like the purchasing power of the dollars that people have, and where things are going. I think it's going to get worse.
What do you think about how that all rolls through to bring it back to energy, to oil prices? It's just kind of like I read this thing the other day that was like the importance of denominating, barrels of oil in USD or like I think euros or whatever. But basically, they were like the times that dictators or leaders have tried to shift away from that has not ended well for those leaders that have tried to pull away from that. And that could be circumstantial, right? Like the reason why they were trying to pull away from it was because of a bunch of other bad things. So I know that it's causal there. But it's just interesting to think about how that all flows into the price of oil. You've got, I just don't see inflation slowing down for a lot of reasons, but I do see the economy slowing down. It's just, again, it gets back to this being a real time.
It's that round numbers at the gas pump, and you just keep thinking through like, since we've done this, like we started in May, and I've talked about $100 oil happening, last
Right.
summer. I still think we're going for 130 plus. And I think that the curve is going to, go from backwardation to contango. and you're going to see an incentive to start storing going into next winter. And that's it's going to be a really radical shift in what ends up happening. And then with that, that's where you have real inflation and demand destruction. Because I don't see supplies, necessarily coming. And then you start thinking about, can the U.S. add another 1 million barrels a day, maybe get back to 13? Yeah, that's a possibility in 23 or 24 if there's a call. But there isn't an easy call on more supply, and that's that's kind of where I just see things shaking out.
I think there's going to be unthinkably high price of oil in my children's lifetime. I don't know, maybe in my lifetime too. But I think like if you look at my dad, or you look at like my grandpa, I did this thought exercise. It was like my grandpa, my dad, me, my kids, and we've seen not consistent or average prices that have done this, but we've seen spikes like, in my lifetime, 10x, 15x. My dad's lifetime, I mean, even like low single digits. My grandpa, like a couple dollars a barrel. And you've seen it go to where it is today. So why would it be different? Why would it be different for my 1-year-old? Why would he not see $400, $500, $600 barrel oil when it's happened to the last 4 generations? I mean, I don't know. It sounds ridiculous, but probably as ridiculous as $100 and whatever dollars a barrel sounded to somebody when it was $3 a barrel. I don't know. Maybe because the tech is deflationary and we're getting better technology-wise, and it's just not going to get there because we're going to be able to exploit it better. That would be my counter to that thought process, is that we just have enough tech that we can get it out of the ground and we can get that supply. But the central planners, they're messing it up. I don't know. Anyways, that kind of thought that it could get to 200, 300, 400 in our lifetime, I don't know. Is that crazy to think that could happen if events unfolded in a certain way? At least spiked. I'm not saying averaged or stayed there.
I haven't spent any time thinking about it. What I think is the last barrel sold may be some of the most expensive barrels ever produced.
Yeah.
That's the way I've actually thought about it. And the last MCF sold. Like the reality is like, what will be the shift in how we make plastics, right, or the other base loads that. But I think that the thing, like, we're going to produce a lot of cheap barrels over the next 50 years, and then you're going to have to start finding more expensive barrels. So, right. Yeah. What I was thinking about when you started talking about your grandpa, you kind of think about life. And my grandpa was born early 1900s, emigrated from Finland to the UP of Michigan, 1908. But then you think about, so 1918, he's 18, and World War I is starting to happen. Comes back, has the reality of the 20s is good. Becomes a hobo essentially, and goes from Michigan out to Washington State, tries to swim the Columbia River when he's 30. Wow. While that's going on, he then have this guy Herr Hitler that's starting to come up in Germany, and so now you're starting to think about when my dad was born, was in the like you start getting into World War II happening. My dad then serves in Vietnam. Right. My grandpa's now in his late 50s, early 60s. You've then gone to the moon, and then he flies on airplanes for seeing me graduate from college. So you kind of go from like emigrating by boat to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, riding on a train and hoboing to find a job, almost killing yourself swimming across the Columbia River on a bet, living through World War I, World War II, a pandemic, seeing men land on the moon. And then like you think about what happens for the people, we were just talking about it, we're very close to hiring people that were born in 2000. Like it's not that far away. Like in 2 years, I talked to a guy today that hired someone that was born in 2000.
I talked to a guy today that's 20, and he dropped out of college during the pandemic. He's really smart too, and he dropped out because he was like, "This is stupid. They're not even letting me go to class." And he has a good job now, and he's doing good work. And I really think he's smart. And he's like 20 years old. He can't even drink a beer.
Like exactly. Born in 2001. Didn't know what 9/11 was. Right. So like you think about what his 100 years of life could be as far as like what he's gone through. So now he's 20, he's living through a pandemic. You have your first chance of a nuclear action where Europe's at war essentially. The Cold War has effectively been re-revved up. So what's going to happen next? And so when you talked about going to $400 a barrel, in that 20-year-old smart kid's lifetime, just compare that to my grandpa's. there's a whole lot of changes that I think can happen, and you just got to take those changes to heart as you think about where you want to go and where you want to spend your time.
Even in
So
my life, I mean, look, it's like there was this tweet the other day that said that people that were born from I think they said 86 to 1992, or they had like this really sliver, it was like a 5-year stretch, and I was born in 87. And they were like, we're like a special generation. And they were basically saying because we got to see the analog and all this stuff prior to the digital and prior to the internet, we got to see the crossover at that time in our life. It's like you got to see it too, right? But it was like at that kind of adolescent, we went through like high school, and this was changing through like from middle school through college. It was like barely any internet. If you had dial up, no real cell phone connectivity other than brick kind of Nokia's to like social media,
right.
like within that span. And they were just talking about that, and that's kind of crazy. And so it's like, what's that going to be like for someone who's 20 or like my children? It's bizarre, but and there's a lot of world events that are going to happen. We get kind of lulled into. I think the 90s were relatively calm. The 2000s, you had 9/11. I mean, 90s had some wars. There was Middle East stuff, but we've been kind of lulled to sleep a little bit outside of the technological changes. But to close it and to bring it back to Europe and Ukraine, because that's where my heart and mind has been like the last couple weeks. And I think that you made me read that book, Courage is Calling. And I know we're not going to do a full thing on it, but that is, and I'm not quite done with it. I'm about 2/3, 3/4 of the way done. Incredible book. I'm like going down the Ryan Holiday rabbit hole now, and I've already been like a fan of Stoicism. And man, it is so good. That book is like inspiring. Like I want to go back and reread it already. It's just
it's phenomenal. I had Ryan come and talk to our group in Austin for our first kickoff. Spent a little personal money, but I really do think that his perspective and the philosophy of courage is a hard thing to find in the world. And I think that like making those radical shifts and taking the hard leap of, we've got a friend that hopefully will be on the pod in a little bit that's at a big firm, and his parents have always said, like, if you would just like leave and take that entrepreneurial leap, you ought to do that. And it's just hard to make those steps. But I always encourage everybody bet on yourself and take as much risk as you can early in life, because there's a lot of opportunity to find correction later in life, and you just get those experiences that you'll never ever give up. But that courage comment, I think, really hit home, and is like one of the things that is super critical in how you make decisions and how you live your life. Like, everybody has to pay their bills, and everybody has to figure out what they're going to do to take care of themselves and their families. And those are hard choices. And, right now, a lot of Ukraine is shut down. Like, you listen to people, like some of the daily, like, I started and stopped listening to the New York Times daily, but they've done some phenomenal interviews of families that are, down in subways, tunnels, essentially, where there's no jobs, like there's not like any economy happening, and there's a degree of like there's not a grocery store open. It kind of reminds me of post Katrina New Orleans, where you found whatever you could, but we could drive and like get to Baton Rouge. Like, they don't have anywhere to go, and like that level of like human suffering, I think, is the thing that those people are exhibiting a lot of courage right now. And
tremendous amounts of courage.
Mm-hmm. I mean, like standing up to, a nuclear power that decided to invade on a horrible decision by an autocratic, crazy person, it seems, that underestimated like every outcome and has no off ramp. Those are super brave people.
Very brave. So. No, that book has been. I can relate to it in so many different layers. It's like the Ukraine stuff is completely hitting home, and not just Ukraine, but just war in general. My grandpa and my great grandfather fought. My great grandfather came over from Italy, couldn't speak English, the 19 teens early, and then he got sent back to Europe to fight in World War I for America, even though could barely even speak English. And then and survived that when he was young, and then brought his family over, and he was over here already working. And then my grandpa fought in Korea and had to go over, and he was, 17, 18 years old. I think got in even early and went over there and fought. And so you just have this history, and it hits with all those things, and you feel very blessed. But then the other things that we've talked about taking risks, like you mentioned earlier, on entrepreneurship, taking risks in business and in life. And then I think the other part that's really hit home for me is around this idea of like right and wrong and morals and ethics, and taking a risk around believing in something that you think is right or wrong and speaking up for that. And I think that, and then the last one is being a leader in an organization or in life. And I think that all those things take courage. And there's this quote that I have here that I wrote down from the book. And he says, "When you're a leader, the buck always stops with you. Always, the perks of leadership come at a cost, but the tax on courage is steep. You will take heat." He says, "If that bothers you, you might be happier saying nothing, doing nothing, being nothing." And it's just like, if that doesn't get you riled up, to want to have some courage, then I don't know what does. But that book is awesome. Reading it.
Yeah, we should actually spend a little time just kind of talking through some of the quotes and really just some of the message. I think it is an opportunity for people to learn. And it's like little steps of right and wrong. It's you see something that just doesn't feel right. You have a choice. And what is it? Great minds talk about ideas, average minds talk about events, and small minds talk about people. And I find a lot of people that talk about people, and the reality is it's the idea that matters. And that's where you ought to be having these conversations. And I think that's what we're trying to do. So
maybe we should take a 2-week break more often. I feel like I don't know if it was just the last 2 weeks had so much happen that we had a lot to talk about. But I've really enjoyed this one. For some reason, like it didn't work streaming to LinkedIn. I'll take the recording and I'll stream it there tomorrow. But it streamed on the others. But this one was really fun.
Cool. Good catching up, and talk to you later, Max.
All right, we'll talk to you.
Have a great